I woke up to the muffled screams. My heart pounded as I struggled to free myself from the duct tape binding my wrists. The air in the basement was damp and thick, the smell of mold mixing with something far more putrid. The only light came from a small, barred window near the ceiling, casting just enough illumination to reveal the horror surrounding me. Pictures of missing people, trinkets, and keepsakes displayed like trophies. The screams grew louder, echoing off the concrete walls. I had to get out, had to save them. I pulled harder, the tape cutting into my skin, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Not after everything we had discovered. It all started 3 months ago when my family moved into the quaint suburb of Pine Grove. We had relocated from my husband's new job, eager for a fresh start in a safe and quiet neighborhood. Our new home was perfect, with a spacious backyard for our kids, Emma and Jake, to play in, and friendly neighbors who welcomed us warmly. One neighbor stood out among the rest, Mr. Morris. He was an elderly man, perhaps in his late 60s, with silver hair and a kind smile that crinkled his eyes. He lived alone in the house next to ours, and he was always impeccably dressed, even when mowing his lawn or tending to his garden. He quickly became a fixture in our lives, always offering a helping hand and engaging in pleasant conversation. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said on our first day, bringing over a freshly baked apple pie. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." It seemed too good to be true. And it was. The first sign that something was amiss came when Emma, our 8-year-old daughter, started having nightmares. She would wake up screaming, claiming she saw scary people in her dreams, people who were trapped and couldn't get out. We chalked it up to the stress of the move and her active imagination, but the nightmares persisted. One night, after tucking Emma back into bed, I noticed a faint light coming from Mr. Morris's basement window. It was well past midnight, and curiosity got the better of me. I crept closer to our fence, peering into his yard. The light flickered, and I could make out the silhouette of Mr. Morris moving around in the basement. It struck me as odd, but I dismissed it as an old man's late-night project. The following week, I was out walking our dog, Max, when I ran into Mrs. Thompson, another neighbor. She was an elderly woman with a penchant for gossip. "How are you settling in, dear?" she asked, patting Max's head. "Good, thank you. Everyone's been so welcoming." "That's wonderful to hear. Just be careful with that Mr. Morris," she said, lowering her voice. "He's always been a bit peculiar." "Peculiar how?" I asked, intrigued. "Oh, just strange habits. He's been living alone for so long, you know. Some people say they've seen him out late at night, wandering the streets. Others claim they've heard strange noises coming from his house. But it's probably just silly rumors." I smiled politely and continued on my way, but her words lingered in my mind. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Mr. Morris. I decided to keep a closer eye on him. One evening, while watching TV, I saw Mr. Morris leave his house. He was carrying a large, heavy-looking bag and loaded it into the trunk of his car. My curiosity piqued. I decided to follow him. I grabbed my keys and slipped out the door, careful not to wake my husband or the kids. I tailed him at a safe distance as he drove to the outskirts of town. He pulled into an abandoned lot and got out, dragging the bag behind him. I parked a few streets away and approached on foot, my heart pounding in my chest. From behind a row of bushes, I watched as he dug a hole and buried the bag. What was in it? My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. When he finally drove off, I waited until his car disappeared before I approached the freshly dug earth. With trembling hands, I unearthed the bag. It was filled with old clothes, stained with something dark, something that looked suspiciously like blood. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The next morning, I called the police anonymously, reporting what I had found. They investigated but came back with nothing substantial. The clothes, they said, were too old and degraded to yield any useful evidence. They assured me that they would keep an eye on Mr. Morris, but I could tell they thought it was just a prank or a mistake. Feeling defeated, I confided in my husband, John. He was skeptical at first but agreed to help me keep watch. We set up a camera facing Mr. Morris's house, hoping to catch something that would corroborate my story. Days turned into weeks, and we saw nothing out of the ordinary. I began to doubt myself, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. But then, one night, the camera caught something chilling. Mr. Morris was seen dragging what appeared to be a body into his house. The footage was grainy and unclear, but it was enough to convince John that something was seriously wrong. We took the evidence to the police again, and this time they promised to investigate more thoroughly. The next day, a police officer came to our house, informing us that they had questioned Mr. Morris but found no evidence of foul play. They warned us about making false accusations and advised us to mind our own business. Feeling desperate and alone, we decided to take matters into our own hands. We devised a plan to search Mr. Morris's house while he was out. It was risky, but we were determined to uncover the truth. That Saturday, Mr. Morris left for his usual grocery run. John and I slipped into his backyard and found the basement window unlocked. We climbed inside, our hearts racing with fear and anticipation. The basement was dark and cold, filled with old furniture and dusty boxes. We searched for anything that could explain the strange happenings. And then, we found it, a hidden door behind a shelf, leading to a small, windowless room. The room was a nightmare. It was filled with photos of missing people, each one labeled with dates and cryptic notes. There were personal items, watches, jewelry, even children's toys, laid out meticulously. The walls were covered in newspaper clippings about unsolved disappearances. In the center of the room was a large, blood-stained table. Chains and shackles hung from the ceiling, and various tools were scattered around, a horrifying testament to the unimaginable torture that had taken place here. We were frozen in shock when we heard the sound of the basement door creaking open. Mr. Morris was back, and we were trapped. He found us in the room, his kind smile replaced by a cold, menacing glare. "I warned you," he said softly, "not to meddle in things you don't understand." He lunged at John, knocking him to the ground. I screamed and tried to run, but Mr. Morris grabbed me, dragging me back to the table. He tied me down, his strength overwhelming. John was still unconscious, blood trickling from a wound on his head. "You shouldn't have come here," Mr. Morris whispered, his breath hot on my face. "Now, you'll become part of my collection." I don't know how long I was unconscious, but when I woke up, I was alone in the basement, bound and gagged. My body ached, and I could barely move. The room was silent except for the distant, muffled cries I had heard earlier. My mind raced. Where was John? What had Mr. Morris done to him? I managed to free my hands, the tape cutting into my skin. My heart pounded as I frantically searched for a way out. The basement window was my only hope. I climbed up, forcing it open and pulling myself through. The fresh air hit my face, but I couldn't stop. I ran to the nearest house, banging on the door until someone answered. The police arrived within minutes, storming Mr. Morris's house and rescuing John and the other victims we had heard. Mr. Morris was arrested, his basement revealing horrors beyond imagination. The missing people in the photos were all found, or rather, their remains were. It turned out that Mr. Morris had been preying on unsuspecting neighbors for years, using his charm and kindness to hide his true nature. He was a monster hiding in plain sight, and we had been his latest targets. The neighborhood was never the same after that. The once quiet, safe streets were now haunted by the memories of what had happened. We moved away, unable to bear living next door to that house of horrors. But even now, I can't escape the nightmares, the faces of the victims, the sound of their screams, and the terrifying realization that evil can lurk behind the most innocent of smiles. In the end, we learned the hard way that sometimes, the real monsters are the ones who live right next door.